Okay, now that we have gotten through the kidneys, we're going to talk about the concept of overall homeostasis in the body. So there's basically three types of balance that we need to maintain to stay in a good working order. We need to deal with the fluid balance, so the amount and volume of water, the electrolyte balance, which is then going to obviously deal with the solute load in our fluids, and then the acid base or the pH balance of the body. So there's multiple systems involved here. We've got the urinary system, obviously, the respiratory system, digestive, which we haven't gotten to yet, integumentary, endocrine, nervous, cardio, and lymphatic. So pretty much all of the systems aside from the reproductive system and the musculoskeletal system are involved at least in maintaining homeostasis. And even those actually, the muscles and the bones particularly in terms of electrolyte balance can come into play, but these systems are the primary systems. So we're going to start with fluid. First, looking at the concept of where is fluid, what is the volume of fluid in our body. Generally, we're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 liters of fluid in the body. About 2/3 of that is intracellular, so it lies within a cell membrane. The other 1/3 is extracellular. The majority of that is interstitial, so it is the tissue fluids or the fluid that is found surrounding the cells. And then the other small component, so about 3 liters, is found in your plasma. Now, there's consistent movement between all of these compartments. So, here we can kind of see the pathway that is going to start when we're drinking water. So this is going to come in, we're going to absorb it into the blood. From the blood, we're going to exchange with the tissues, sometimes moving in, sometimes moving out. So that's our capillary bulk flow there. Some of that fluid is going to get lost to the tissues. It's going to get picked up by the lymphatic system and then, of course, eventually dumped back into our bloodstream. So there's a constant movement between intracellular, interstitial, plasma. So when we talk about these volumes of water, it's important to understand that they're not static. So the intracellular fluid is not always intracellular. The interstitial is not always interstitial. There's a movement. And that is all then based on the principles of osmosis that allows us to move that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the composition of fluids. So here we're looking at the composition, the ion composition in plasma, interstitial, and intracellular fluids. And we can see that it is not equal. So we do not just have fluid. Each of these has their own specific composition. Sodium is very high in the extracellular fluids. Potassium is very high in the intracellular fluids. That is the basis of our membrane potential right there. We learned about that in 251, the idea that we have to have a high level of sodium extracellularly and a high level of potassium inside of the cell in order to maintain membrane potential. And here we see the evidence of that. Calcium is pretty much low everywhere, but you can see here that it is non-existent in the intracellular fluid. Yet, we know that cells have calcium in them. We've talked about things that calcium does. Go back to those muscle cells. Calcium is required to bind to troponin to move tropomyosin to allow cross-bridge cycling. So then where's this calcium? It's bound up. It is sequestered in the cell. It is not sitting in the intracellular fluid because whenever calcium is in the intracellular fluid, it's functioning as a messenger. It is binding to something and causing a cellular effect. Therefore, we don't see high levels of calcium in the intracellular fluid. It's all inside of the endoplasmic reticulum, or in a muscle cell, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We have calcium pumps in those membranes that consistently draw that calcium back into the organelle so that we don't continue to send whatever signal that calcium is functioning as. So even though we know cells have calcium in them, we don't see it present in the intracellular fluid. Chloride, very high in the extracellular fluid because it likes to hang out with sodium. Phosphates. So things that we can use phosphates for in the intracellular fluid because it's very high there. Well, we got all that DNA. Okay, so DNA has a sugar phosphate backbone. We've got the phospholipids that we need to synthesize to maintain our membranes. We've got ATP. So we have a constant need to make sure that we have phosphates. So as we go through the ADP, ATP cycle, we have something to add and make ATP. So I'm not going to go through every one of these, but my point is that if you go back in thinking about the things that you have already learned and the systems that you have already worked with, there is evidence for why these different ionic compositions exist in these different fluids. This chapter is going to be all about you taking the information that you have learned and tying it together. So this is really almost a culmination of a lot of the systems that you have talked about. And so you're going to have to go back to them and draw that information forward. Okay, so water balance requires that intake matches output. Intake is mostly through drinking the water we get in foods and a very small amount of metabolic water, which is made during cellular respiration. Losses are through feces, your breath, the cutaneous transpiration, which is the loss of fluid through our skin that is not noticeable. So this is not the same as sweating. This is more almost like a vapor. Sweat then is going to contribute to that, and then the primary loss would be through urine. So somewhere in the neighborhood of like 2.5 liters a day brought in and then also lost. So the regulation of intake is going to be based on two different triggers, if you will, both of which we've already talked about. If we see a drop in blood volume that causes a drop in pressure, it's going to activate the RAS system. And one of the effects of angiotensin II was to increase your sense of thirst, which then is going to drive you to seek water. The other would be to increase the osmolarity of your blood and extracellular fluids. So as you lose water, your ECF becomes more concentrated, it gets salty, and that's going to stimulate those osmoreceptors, again, sense of thirst, and we're going to have water-seeking behavior. Now, when we drink the water, it does not immediately transfer into the blood and change the blood volume and change the osmolarity. It takes a period of time for us to actually absorb across the digestive tract. So there's actually a short-term negative feedback that works and then a long-term negative feedback. As soon as you begin to drink and your stomach distends, that is actually the negative feedback that comes back and shuts this off. It's essentially saying, okay, we've done what we need to do. We have drank the water. Now shut off all of these mechanisms that are telling me to drink more water so that I don't go too far in the positive direction and overhydrate. We have done what we need to do, and now we're just waiting to get to the point where we absorb and the blood is rehydrated, bringing the volume and pressure up and bringing the osmolarity down. Output we've talked about, so we know this is based on ADH secretion. So we know if we are well hydrated, we do not secrete ADH and we produce huge volumes of dilute urine. If we are dehydrated, we produce ADH, we utilize that salinity gradient in the medulla, and we're going to draw in and reabsorb more water, ending up with a very small volume of very concentrated urine. Here is kind of the mechanism of this. So you've got the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. We've got baroreceptors that are all talking to the posterior pituitary. As we release, we're going to increase water reabsorption, and that then, using negative feedback, will get us back to where we need to go. So there's a couple different chemicals that play a role in the regulation of water output that might be familiar to you. alcohol and caffeine. So both of these are what are known as diuretics. They increase the volume of urine, and they are both what are called dehydrators because they interfere with your ability to reabsorb water. They do it in a different way. Alcohol inhibits ADH. So once you have begun to drink alcohol, the ability to secrete this ADH, so all of this happens, but the ability to secrete ADH to fix it is decreased. So even though we are saying, hey, extracellular fluid's getting salty, plasma volume's dropping, we're definitely dehydrated, we can't utilize ADH, and we continue to urinate out huge volumes of fluid. That is why you get dehydrated when you're drinking alcohol. It's also why it's suggested that you drink water while you're drinking alcohol. It's not to kill your buzz. It's to rehydrate. It's to basically say, okay, we know we're going to be urinating out a huge amount of fluid here, so let me put some extra fluid in my body to compensate for that loss. Caffeine is also going to do this. It's a dehydrator. It's a diuretic. It does so by inhibiting aldosterone. So when aldosterone is inhibited, then we know that we're not going to reabsorb sodium, which means that we're not going to reabsorb water. Again, dehydrating. So both of these chemicals dehydrate us. When you mix them together, you're really kind of knocking out pretty much all the major mechanisms to rehydrate your body. So you want to be careful with that. If you're planning to go out and do some drinking this weekend, drink some water. If nothing else, when you get done drinking your alcohol, drink as much water as possible. It will help you not feel the effects of water or of the alcohol quite so much. Because it will rehydrate you. So if you can, when you're crawling to your bed, just down huge amounts of water, it will actually alleviate some of the symptoms of a hangover the next day. So there is your tip for the day. Drink as much water as possible. All right, disorders of water balance are going to fall into two categories. We're going to have a reduction or an elevation of total body water. So we're going to talk about dehydration as it is the more common and more serious of the two. Dehydration comes in two versions, a hypertonic and an isotonic version. So in a hypertonic dehydration, we have a true negative water balance, which means that we have lost water from our body. So if we have profuse sweating, we are going to lose water and a little bit of salt, but we can't actually excrete as much salt as we do water. So what we end up having is a negative water balance, and that is going to leave our body in a state of hypertonicity. We're losing water. Volume depletion would be a loss of water and solutes at the same time. So, for example, through a hemorrhage. This is going to maintain isotonic conditions. We are not going to trigger any of our mechanisms that deal with hypertonicity when we are losing water and solutes at the same rate. So here is where we can kind of differentiate the difference and why we have both ADH and aldosterone. So when we are losing water alone, ADH is a better hormone to release because it's going to draw water back in as opposed to sodium. We're already hypertonic. We don't need more sodium. Whereas if we're hemorrhaging and losing our water and solutes at the same time, the release of aldosterone is going to draw back in water and solutes. So in reality, usually they do work together, but here's an example of where one would be the primary versus the other due to its actual course of action. Overhydration is very, very difficult, and that is due to the fact that your kidneys work extremely well. So here we are looking at fluid intake versus blood volume. Okay. So if we don't take in, if we're over here at, less than a liter of fluid intake a day, really low, we'll die. Okay. Our kidneys can't compensate for not enough water. As we increase the volume of water, we can sort of move out of this danger zone into what would be normal. But see what happens to this line? Blood volume peaks. And then it doesn't matter. You can be in water diuresis, which means that you have a huge excess of water in your body, but your blood volume stays stable because your kidneys are so good at dumping extra water. So it's actually difficult with functional kidneys to overhydrate yourself because of this. Your kidneys will get rid of whatever amount of water it needs to maintain this proper blood volume. They can't help you down here when you don't have enough. That's why dehydration is more significant. Overhydration is very uncommon because your kidneys are working. Now, if your kidneys are not working or they're failing, that's when we would have a problem here. Volume excess, again, would keep us in an isotonic state. Hypotonic hydration, which is a true positive water balance or a water intoxication, very, very rare, but it would leave us in a hypotonic state. Main concerns here would be edema. So that water is going to have to go somewhere and it's going to push out into the tissues.